Perfect. Shall we?
So I just started the recording,
Yep.
and I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. We got Japan by all of us.
All right. You ready, Professor?
Yep. Go ahead.
Okay. So we decided to do our presentation on Japan. Oh, can you go back? Thank you.
Yeah, you're good. My fault.
So, all good. So, I chose to talk about talk about Japan's GDP per capita, and GNP. So Japan actually has the third largest economy in the world, even though it's, one of the smallest countries in the world. And they also have one of the third highest GDP in the world, which is about 5 trillion, and it makes up about 4.22% of the world's GDP, actually, in the world economy. I decided to compare Japan with U.S. and China because, those are the other two that are generally thought to be ahead of Japan, but there's actually a couple things Japan might be a little bit ahead on. U.S. Their GDP comes in at about a little over 4 times the amount of Japan's, which is about 21 trillion. And then China has over 2 times the amount of GDP as Japan at about 14 trillion. Now, when looking at GDP per capita, Japan's actually at around 39,000, a little over. And while China actually sits at around 9,770, which is significantly lower for being such a big economic power. But that goes along with the immense population that is in China. And then as far as the U.S. is the highest right now in the world, which is about $62,794. Now, when we're looking at gross national product decrease by about 3, and then the U.S. is currently at 0.3 trillion, which is pretty huge numbers right there, and especially because Japan's actually still third in GNP in the world, and just goes to show how far ahead the U.S. and China is at the moment in certain aspects. And another crazy thing is how huge the manufacturing industry is, especially for cars in Japan. And that's it's Japan's by far biggest thing, because 1 trillion of Japan's GDP actually comes from manufacturing cars, which is about 20% of their GDP in general, which is just huge. So, and then as far as their competitiveness in Japan, Japan actually has a population of 126.5 million people, but the country of Japan is only around 146,000 square miles. And that leaves it at about 199 people per square mile. And to put that in perspective, the state of Texas is a little over 2 times the size of Japan, which is around 270,000 square miles. And they have 29 million people, leaving them with 110 people per square mile. So that just goes to show how many people are in Japan and how competitive they are as far as businesses, and how hard it is to make a living in Japan without, having a rigorous college education. All right, good, Jeff.
Hey, so the political and legal description. So Japan's law system is actually based off of a civil law system. We're mostly familiar with our common law system, which is from British, but this is a model after European, which of Germany and France. The legal system was established in the Meiji Restoration, which is after World War II, after they kind of moved away from militarism and that extreme nationalism which involved them in World War II in the first place. So then I kind of wrote, so the civil system is actually derived from Roman law, and it holds value to like statutes instead of common law practice, which is used by judicial opinions, kind of like our Supreme Court. They don't have anything like that. It's usually by statutes versus having judicial law determine whether something becomes legal or not. So next slide, Jeff. All right, so the business implications of the political and legal system. So Japan, since it is like as Lane had talked about, it's the third biggest economy in the world. They tend to stay out of actually international business. They're very to themselves. Since Japan is under that civil system, they're also a bureaucracy, which means that their decisions in their country are made by government officials instead of elected representatives, kind of like our Senate or House of Representatives. With this being said, it's a lot of companies have to actually jump through a lot of hoops for them to gain approval by the government to break that barrier to start business in Japan. I think this also has to do with a lot of the fact that there's just so many people in there. And as Lane was talking about, there's such a competitive, people have to compete a lot, and having another business kind of break in, compared to the native businesses, it can prove to be a challenge. So this will be, so trying to expand into Japan's market, it would be a challenge due to their bureaucracy and just their laws, versus they're a little more controlled than, I guess, a free market system. So next slide. So next would be culture. So I broke this out into kind of that web that we had in our textbook minus the economics, because I kind of left that with our GDP mix that we were going to talk about. So I broke this. So first one is going to be religion. Japan practices two major religions, which is Shudo and Buddhism. Buddhism was imported around the 6th century from China, which is usually kind of when it blossomed, and also through Korea. It clashed with the native Shinto, but due to the fact that it was very complex, Buddhism has a lot more theory in it. The common folk didn't really attach onto it, so it's kind of like a blend of Shudo and Buddhism now. It does not play a big role in Japanese life. Most Japanese still partake in ceremonies. They still go to shrines on New Year's, birthday, for birth, funerals, and marriages. They still kind of, around that kind of culture as far as religion, but it doesn't really play a big part in their everyday life. Next. So the political philosophy, this one was very large. It was hard for me to kind of get it down to compressed, but the current political philosophy started in 1868 when Japan kind of opened up to Western influences, because they were a very closed off nation, very nationalistic versus globalization. So one of their main philosophers, Kitaro, was the first one to kind of construct this new philosophy system based on Western style. Japan went back and forth through the years with collectivism, which is also very popular, which we talked about in previous chapters in this class. Collectivism is very popular in more Asian countries versus individualism, which is very popular, in Western civilizations. So, of course, after World War II, Japan experienced a greater freedom of thought and expression. This stimulated a lot of philosophers to kind of figure out why they kind of broke into this ultra nationalism and militarism, and kind of what brought them there. And then still sorry, I lost my thought. So now they're trying to find that perfect blend between having that kind of Western and Asian traditions of hoping to kind of come together for a monocultural perspective. There was another philosopher who kind of believed that you should be in the middle between individualism and collectivism. But they're still trying to find that perfect blend. So next slide. So next would be education and language. So education, the Japanese have a long traditional respect for education. Primary and secondary education is highly competitive in Japan. Most of the graduates of high school actually compete with American colleges in math. So they focus a lot on engineering in the country too. I think it was like 2/3 of the country, they push engineering, which is obviously heavy in math. So, and then next would be language. So the Japanese is unrelated to any other language. I know there's like a lot of the Romance languages would be like Spanish, English, French, stuff like that, but Japan is unrelated, and I think it's due to obviously the fact that they were kind of on the remote island for most of their time in existence. However, there is due to the geographical variations on the country, there are different dialects depending on isolated locations. So next slide. All right, social stratification. So Japan has a class system throughout most of the historical periods, which is like the Edo, the feudal, and like the shogunate. However, now it's very hard to explain. It has to do with like their collective, like the way that they think. So they don't necessarily believe that they're like in a caste system. It's not like India where they're stuck in that one spot and they can't move up. But due to the fact that they believe in this collectivism kind of in their way of thinking, that they're more, so it's more of a vertical linkage. So individuals are aware of their status in a group, but not necessarily the horizontal linkage of individuals in similar statuses or positions within society as a whole. Kind of the fact that they're grouped it by their company, but they're not grouped. They're not worried, I guess, about moving up. They're worried about like just being in their role, which I got some of this also from the textbook too, about how they are more likely to say that they're a part of company A versus like they're a secretary at, like how I would say my position here in the United States. So I think it's more of a mindset that has more to do with the social stratification than it does like an actual caste system in place. So next would be our social structure. Japan is a very homogenous society.